I was 67 years old when, for the first time in many years, I prepared for a trip just for myself. That morning, the house was tranquil. I laid a long floral dress out on the bed, the kind I always saved for special occasions. I put on sunscreen, packed my old but sturdy straw bag, and checked my documents one more time. There was no rush. I simply wanted to enjoy the feeling of having something to look forward to. It was a cruise my son, Daniel, had invited me to join months earlier, my first trip since my husband passed away. A trip I had quietly believed meant that, perhaps, I was still a part of my son's little family. My phone buzzed as I stood in front of the mirror. A message. "Mom, I'm sorry. The plans have changed. You won't be able to come with us on this trip. Melissa wants it to be just for family." I read the message twice. Then a third time. The room remained quiet. The wall clock kept ticking steadily. But inside me, something suddenly sank, deep and fast. My heart beat harder, then slowed, as if trying to process what had just happened. Just for family. I set the phone down on the bed and sat there for a long time without moving. The floral dress lay neatly where I had placed it. The straw bag remained open, waiting to be packed. And in that moment, one question echoed in my mind more clearly than anything else. So what am I in my own family? If you're listening to this story and see a reflection of yourself somewhere in it, perhaps you are not alone. Here we share stories about family, aging, and the importance of respect. If you'd like to continue this journey, stay with the channel. I don't know how long I sat there like that. I only know that moment wasn't just disappointment over a canceled trip. It was the beginning of something else, something I couldn't yet put a name to. After that message, I didn't cry right away. I just sat still, letting everything settle. Then familiar fragments of memory began to surface. Not loudly, not violently. They came slowly, like things I had tried not to think about for years. In the past, Daniel used to stop by every Sunday for dinner. I cooked the dishes he'd loved since childhood. Sometimes Melissa ate happily too, complimenting the food and asking for recipes. But those dinners gradually became less frequent. Sometimes Daniel was busy. Sometimes Melissa was tired. Then they said, "We'll do it another time." That other time drifted farther and farther away. I told myself that children grow up and lead their own lives. I shouldn't interfere. Then there was Lily's birthday. That year, she turned 3. I bought her a small light blue dress and wrapped it carefully. But as the day approached, no one called me. I didn't ask. I assumed they were having a simple celebration at home. That evening, I saw photos of the party on social media. Lily was smiling brightly among people I didn't recognize. I wasn't in a single picture. I stared at the screen for a long time. Then I turned it off. The dress remained untouched in its box. There were things I only found out about after they had already happened. A party, a short weekend trip, a family gathering with Melissa's relatives. I wasn't invited, but I wasn't informed either. I only came across them by chance, through a few posts or hastily taken photos. At first I felt sad, then confused. Finally, I began questioning myself. Did I talk too much? Was I truly outdated? Did my presence make them uncomfortable? I became more careful in every conversation. I spoke less, asked fewer questions, offered no opinions unless I was asked. I made myself smaller, thinking it would make things easier for everyone. But one thing never changed. Whenever they needed help, I was always the first person Daniel called. When they renovated their house and ran short on money, I transferred funds without asking many questions. When Daniel's car broke down during a stressful period at work, I let him use mine. During difficult months, I quietly covered most of the necessary expenses, as if it were simply a habit. I never kept track. I never demanded anything in return. I believed that was what a mother was supposed to do. It was just that I began to realize an uncomfortable truth. I was remembered when they needed help, but forgotten when they were building lives of their own. And it was in that moment, sitting alone with the message excluding me from the trip, that I understood this pain wasn't new. It had simply been given a name. That evening, after the house had fallen into silence, I opened the drawer in my home office. It was where I had kept essential documents for many years. I didn't intend to do anything, at least not at that moment. I just wanted to look through them as a way to calm myself. I retrieved the file for the house where Daniel and Melissa were living. The suburban home where Lily was growing up was a place I had visited countless times. I turned each page slowly, carefully. Then I stopped. The name on the property title was still mine, not Daniel's, not the couple's, mine, Evelyn Carter. I sat there for a long time, my hand resting on the papers. There was no sense of victory, no surge of anger, just a quiet surprise, mixed with a touch of confusion. Daniel's voice echoed in my mind, familiar and reassuring. "Don't worry, Mom. We're family." He said that every time I mentioned the paperwork, every time I suggested that maybe we should clarify things for peace of mind. Daniel always smiled, his tone light, as if I were overthinking it. Family. I had believed in that word for far too long, believed in it enough to postpone every serious conversation, believed in it enough to think that between a mother and her child, clarity wasn't necessary. But now, looking at my name on those documents, I suddenly realized something that made my chest tighten. The word family appeared only when everything was going smoothly, when trust was needed, when I was expected to shoulder responsibility, but when I hoped to be present, to be seen as an essential part, that word disappeared. I set the file down on the desk and stood up, pacing the room a few times. Part of me wanted to close the drawer, pretend I had never opened it, to return to my old role, the role of silence, endurance, and convincing myself that everything would eventually be okay. I thought of Daniel. I thought of Lily. I thought about who I would become if I did what I was beginning to consider. A heartless mother? A selfish grandmother? Those questions made me hesitate. I sat back down, my hands clasped together, staring out the window. It was already dark. Outside, every house had its lights on. Life was going on, ordinary as ever. I didn't act that night. I needed time to understand my own emotions, to be sure that if I moved forward, it wouldn't be out of anger or temporary hurt. The next morning, when sunlight fell across my desk, I returned to that drawer once again. This time, I didn't hesitate. I picked up the phone and found the number of the person who had handled my legal matters for many years. When he answered, I spoke in a calm tone. "Robert, I need to see you. It's about my son's house." When I hung up, I knew I had stepped onto the other side. No noise, no drama, but there was no going back to how things had been. Robert's office was on the second floor of an old building. Nothing fancy, but familiar. I had been there many times over the years, primarily to attend to small matters and complete simple paperwork. This time was different. Robert listened as I spoke for a long while. I talked slowly, without raising my voice, without adding or subtracting emotion. I simply recounted what had happened, the house, the expenses I had covered, and the message I had received before the trip. When I finished, he reviewed the file, carefully checking each page. Then he looked up at me, direct and honest. "Evelyn, legally speaking, that house belongs entirely to you. You have full authority to decide. Their consent isn't required." I nodded. I had expected that answer, but hearing it confirmed still made my heart feel a little heavier. Not out of fear, but because I understood that from this point on, everything depended on my choice. "I don't want any trouble," I said, "and I don't want to hurt anyone." Robert nodded. "I understand, and you can handle this quietly." I left his office with a strange feeling, not relief, not anger. It was the feeling of someone who had just realized she had a choice, after years of believing she didn't. I didn't call Daniel. I didn't text Melissa. I handled everything through proper channels via my lawyer, as cleanly and lawfully as possible. Meanwhile, Daniel and Melissa had gone on their trip. In the days that followed, I saw photos of them appear on social media. Blue oceans, elegant dinners, colorful drinks. I didn't seek them out, but they still showed up. Then I received a notification from my bank. They were using my card. Not small charges, expenses I had never allowed myself to indulge in. Spas, private tours, clearly discretionary luxuries. I stared at the notification for a long time. No anger flared. It was simply a quiet confirmation of what I had already begun to understand. I called the bank. I froze the card. Then I blocked Daniel's and Melissa's numbers, not to punish them, but to protect the fragile calm I had just found. From that moment on, all communication was handled by Robert. A week later, Robert called me back, his voice as steady as ever. "There's a buyer interested in the house. They're ready to move quickly." I paused for a moment, then replied, "Proceed according to the law." I didn't sell it at a low price out of spite, nor did I raise the price to profit. I just wanted everything to end cleanly, properly. On the day the papers were signed, my hands didn't shake. I didn't feel like I was doing anything wrong. I was simply stepping out of a role I had carried for far too long. That evening, sitting alone in my old house, one thought was evident to me. I wasn't taking revenge. I was just no longer allowing myself to be hurt. Daniel and Melissa returned after their 3-day trip. I knew not because they told me, but because my phone kept vibrating. Missed calls, message after message. I didn't read them right away. I set the phone aside and took a deep breath. I had prepared myself for this moment, even though I couldn't completely stop myself from trembling. The meeting took place at Robert's office, exactly as I wanted. I didn't want to meet privately. I didn't want emotions to take over. Daniel arrived first. He looked exhausted with dark circles under his eyes. Melissa followed, her face tense, lips pressed tightly together. As soon as they sat down, Daniel spoke up, his voice louder than usual. "What is this supposed to mean, Mom? You sold the house without saying a word to us?" I looked at my son, really looked at him. I didn't see pure concern. I saw panic and anger. "We don't have anywhere to live," Daniel continued. "What about Lily?" Melissa didn't say much. She sighed, her eyes red, then turned to Robert. "We didn't think things would go this far. That house is our family home." I let them finish. I didn't interrupt. I didn't react hastily. When the room finally fell quiet, I spoke. My voice was so calm that it surprised even me. The house is in my name. I've paid most of the related expenses for years. I didn't sell it to make things difficult for anyone. I simply exercised my right. Daniel frowned. "But you never said you were going to do this." I nodded. "That's true. Because before, I always believed that between a mother and her child, things didn't need to be spelled out." Melissa looked at me, her voice trembling. "We've always been grateful to you." I turned to her. "Gratitude isn't pushing someone out of the family and continuing to use their money." That sentence silenced the room completely. Daniel looked down at the table. I saw his shoulders slump slightly. For the first time, he didn't argue back right away. Robert stepped in, briefly outlining the terms. Time to retrieve personal belongings and that all further communication would go through him. Daniel looked up at me again, his voice lower now. "Do you have any idea how we're feeling?" I nodded. "I do, and I've felt that way for many years." I didn't accuse. I didn't list what I had done. I said only that. Melissa turned her face away. Daniel stayed silent for a long time. When he finally looked at me again, his expression had changed. It wasn't just anger anymore. There was something like confusion, like he was seeing for the first time that the woman in front of him was no longer someone who would quietly endure everything. The meeting ended sooner than I expected. No one hugged. There were no apologies, but there was no longer sharp blame either. As we stood to leave, Daniel paused. He looked at me, hesitated, then spoke softly. "Mom, I need time." I nodded. "So do I." When the door closed, I sat back down, feeling tired but lighter. I knew that from that moment on, the relationship between my son and me had changed. Not necessarily for the better, but it was more honest. And for the first time in a long while, I saw Daniel look at me not just as someone to lean on, but as a person with limits. I moved into a seaside apartment on a windy morning. The apartment was small and simple. Nothing that could be called luxurious. One bedroom, a small kitchen, and a balcony facing the ocean. I chose it for the quiet, and because, for the first time in many years, I wanted to live in a place not tied to anyone else's memories, but my own. On the first morning, I woke up just as the sky was beginning to lighten. No alarm clock, no phone calls, only the steady sound of waves in the distance. I made a cup of coffee, took it out to the balcony, and sat down on a wooden chair that still smelled new. I realized how used I had become to waiting for my phone to ring, to check messages the moment I opened my eyes. That morning, I didn't do that. The phone lay still on the table, and I left it there. The feeling was strange, both relieving and empty. I arranged the apartment slowly. No rush. I brought only a few familiar things. An old desk lamp, a few photos from when Daniel was little, and a favorite armchair. I didn't hang many pictures, just enough to remind myself that I had lived a life, not merely existed for others. Sometimes, standing by the window looking out at the sea, I thought of Daniel. Not with anger, but with a familiar worry. Was he okay? Did Lily ask about me? I didn't pick up the phone. I let those questions pass like waves reaching the shore and then pulling back. I began forming new habits. Morning walks along the beach, simple lunches cooked for one, afternoons spent reading or simply sitting still, doing nothing at all. I didn't need to prove that I was busy or useful. At times, I missed the old house. I missed the evenings when everyone was together, even though those had been growing rare for a long time. But at the same time, I noticed that I was breathing more easily. I no longer felt the need to measure every word. I was no longer afraid of being a burden. In the evenings, I stayed on the balcony longer. The sky darkened, the sea deepened in color, and the air turned cool. I thought about everything that had happened, not to blame myself and not to justify myself. I simply accepted that some relationships can only continue when we dare to change our place within them. That sense of peace was fragile. I knew that. I knew there was still a thread pulling me back, no matter how hard I tried to live only for myself. That thread was Lily. Every time I thought of her, my heart softened. I didn't know when I would see her again. I didn't know how far Daniel and Melissa would take things. But in that moment, sitting alone with the sound of the waves, I understood that this pause was necessary, not to run away, but to become strong enough. If one day I had to choose between protecting myself and opening my heart for my little granddaughter, and I knew that day would come sooner than I expected. I received a call from Margaret, Melissa's mother, late one afternoon. Her voice was slow and somewhat hesitant, as if she were weighing every word. We weren't close. In the past, our interactions had been purely polite, but this time I could hear genuine concern in her voice. "Evelyn," she said, "I know things between you and the kids are very tense right now, but Lily, she keeps asking about you." I fell silent for a moment. My chest tightened. "She misses you," Margaret continued. "She keeps asking why she hasn't seen her grandmother in so long. I thought, maybe you should see her, if you're comfortable with that." I closed my eyes and took a deep breath. I had prepared myself for many things, but hearing Lily's name softened every layer of defense I had built. We agreed on a short visit, supervised, not private, just one afternoon. That day, I cleaned the apartment more carefully than usual. I bought flour, sugar, and chocolate, and baked a batch of cookies Lily had loved since she was little. The smell filled the small kitchen, making me feel both warm and anxious. The doorbell rang right on time. Margaret stood outside, holding Lily's hand. When Lily saw me, she froze for a second. Then she let go of her grandmother's hand and ran toward me. "Grandma!" I bent down and wrapped her in my arms. That small, familiar body made me bite my lip to keep from crying. I breathed in the scent of her hair, sunlight and children's soap, the smell I had missed for weeks. "I missed you so much," I whispered. Lily looked up at me with her big, round eyes. "Why haven't you come to my house for so long?" The question came naturally. No blame, no resentment, just innocent curiosity. But it made my heart ache. I didn't know how to answer correctly for a 4-year-old. I gently rubbed her back. "Grandma lives a little farther away now, but I think about you every day." We sat together in the living room. Lily showed me her new drawings and talked about school and her friends. I listened closely, trying to remember every detail, as if afraid of missing something. Margaret sat a short distance away. She didn't interrupt, just observed, giving us just enough space. While eating cookies, Lily asked another question very softly. "Grandma, did I do something wrong?" I froze. I set the cookie down and looked straight into her eyes. "No, you didn't do anything wrong at all. Sometimes grown-ups have difficulties with each other, but that is never your fault." Lily nodded, as if she had been waiting for that answer. Then she smiled, reassured, and continued eating her cookie. The 2 hours passed faster than I expected. When it was time to say goodbye, Lily hugged me tightly. "Please don't disappear again." I hugged her back and whispered, "I'll try." When the door closed, I stood there for a long time. I knew that from that moment on, I was no longer thinking only about myself. I would have to choose between keeping my distance to protect myself and opening my heart for a child who was completely innocent in all of this. After seeing Lily, I didn't sleep well for several nights. I thought a lot. Not about the house I had sold or the arguments. I thought about that child, about the question, did I do something wrong? And the tight hug when she left. I understood that if I continued to keep a complete distance, the one who would suffer most wouldn't be the adults. I called Robert and made another appointment. In his familiar office, I clearly stated what I wanted. I didn't want to prolong the tension. I also didn't want anything left ambiguous. I wanted an explicit, fair agreement to end this dispute in the most proper way possible. Robert went over the numbers again. The amounts Daniel and Melissa had contributed over the years. Not much compared to the total cost, but real contributions nonetheless. I listened without arguing. "I agree to reimburse that amount," I said, "in full, according to the law." Robert nodded and made a note. Then I said something that made him look up at me for a long moment. "I want to set up an education fund for Lily." Robert asked again, to be sure he had heard correctly. I explained slowly. "A sum of money set aside from the proceeds of the house sale. Not small, but well within my means. The money would be locked away to be used only for Lily's education when she turned 18. No early withdrawals, no exceptions. I don't want this money to become the cause of any more conflict," I said. "It's not a tool for control. It's simply preparation." Robert was silent for a moment, then said, "You're doing this for Lily?" I nodded. "Only for her." The agreement was sent to Daniel and Melissa through their lawyer. A few days later, Daniel called me. His voice was no longer as tense as before. "Mom, I've read it," he said. "I don't know what to say." "You don't need to say anything," I replied. "Just understand what I'm doing." Daniel was quiet for a moment. Then he said very softly, "Thank you, Mom." I didn't feel immediate relief, but my heart felt a little lighter. At least I knew I had done the right thing in a way I could accept. On the day the final documents were signed, I signed slowly. No rush, no trembling hands. I didn't feel like I was giving in or conceding. I felt like I was setting a new boundary, more precise than before. I returned what needed to be returned, and I kept what truly mattered. When everything was finished, I left the office and drove back to the seaside apartment. That afternoon, the ocean was calm. The waves were gentle. I sat on the balcony, looking at the horizon. I knew this agreement didn't resolve everything. It didn't erase the hurt that had already happened, but it closed a chapter I had lived in silence for far too long. And more than anything, it gave Lily something I never had when I was young, a guarantee. The news that Daniel and Melissa had separated didn't surprise me, but it still gave me a sinking feeling in my heart. Daniel was the one who called. He didn't say much, only that things had dragged on for too long, that they were both exhausted, and that they needed time apart to think clearly. I listened without asking questions. Some things, once they reach that point, can't be changed by asking more. A few days later, Daniel came to see me. He came alone, unannounced. When I opened the door, I saw him standing there, hands in his jacket pockets, eyes avoiding mine. He looked thinner, quieter. The confidence he once had was gone. We sat down at the kitchen table. I poured tea. Daniel looked around the small apartment as if truly taking in the place where I lived for the first time. "Are you okay, Mom?" he asked. "I'm managing," I replied. "And you?" Daniel let out a breath. "I'm learning how to live differently." We sat in silence for a while. This silence wasn't as heavy as before. It felt like a necessary pause. Then Daniel spoke, his voice slow and measured. "I've been thinking a lot about what happened, about how we treated you." I didn't interrupt. I let him speak. "I'm sorry," Daniel continued. "Not just for that trip, but for all the times I stayed silent when I should have spoken up. I let things go too far." I looked at my son. I saw exhaustion, but I also saw sincerity. This wasn't an apology meant to smooth things over. It was an apology born of realization. "I don't expect you to forgive me right away," Daniel said. "I just want you to know that I understand." I nodded. "I hear you." I didn't hug him. I didn't say everything was behind us. I knew that if I did, all the boundaries I had just built would collapse too quickly. "We can talk," I said. "We can see each other, but everything needs time, and it needs respect." Daniel nodded. "I understand." I stated clearly what I needed. No interference in my personal life. No decisions made on my behalf. And no, placing me in situations where I had to choose between my dignity and my feelings. Daniel listened. He didn't argue. He didn't justify. "I want you to still be Lily's grandmother," he said, "without conditions." I looked at him. "That depends on how you protect her and how you protect this relationship." Daniel lowered his head. "I'll try." The visit didn't last long. As Daniel stood to leave, he turned back and said very softly, "Mom, thank you for still being here." When the door closed, I sat quietly for a while. I didn't feel completely relieved. However, I no longer felt as alone in my emotions as I had before. I understood that this healing wouldn't be quick. There might be setbacks, there might be new scars, but this time, I wasn't stepping in empty-handed. I was stepping in with clear boundaries, and with a clarity I had paid a very high price to gain. I began to sense that something wasn't right when Lily became quieter during our visits. She still smiled, still hugged me when she arrived, but her eyes were no longer as carefree. Sometimes, while playing, she would stop and look at me as if she wanted to ask something, then think better of it. One afternoon, as we were putting together puzzles on the floor, Lily suddenly asked, "Grandma, are you and my mom mad at each other?" My hands paused. I looked at her, keeping my voice as gentle as I could. "No, sweetheart, grown-ups sometimes disagree, but it's not because of you." Lily lowered her head, turning a puzzle piece in her hands. "My mom said, if you loved me, you'd let me go to a better school." The words stunned me. I took a deep breath. "Lily, Grandma always wants what's best for you, but there are things adults have to discuss together first. You don't need to worry." Lily nodded, but I knew she didn't fully understand. And I also knew that a line had just been crossed. That evening, I called Daniel. He answered quickly. I repeated exactly what Lily had said. No more, no less. There was a long silence on the other end. I'm sorry, Mom, Daniel said. I told Melissa not to involve Lily in this. But it still happened, I replied, and it can't continue. Daniel sighed. I'll handle it. A few days later, Robert called me. Melissa had contacted a lawyer requesting changes to the terms of the education fund. She wanted to withdraw part of the money immediately to move Lily to an expensive private school. The reason given was in the child's best interest. I wasn't surprised, but I was saddened. Not because of the money, but because Lily was becoming a reason in an adult dispute. I met with Robert the very next day. We reviewed the entire file. The fund had been set up very clearly, with signatures from both Daniel and Melissa. No one had the right to access it early. Legally, you're in a very strong position, Robert said, but family tensions may increase. I nodded. If I have to choose, I choose Lily's safety. Around the same time, Daniel informed me that Melissa had been exhibiting behavior that concerned him. She talked about money and lawsuits in front of Lily. At times, she even implied that Grandma was making things difficult for her mom. Daniel decided to file for intervention from Child Protective Services, not to punish anyone, but to establish clear boundaries. Things moved faster than I expected. The parties were required to engage in formal proceedings. Melissa reacted fiercely. She claimed I was controlling, that I was using money to apply pressure. I didn't argue. I didn't speak up in front of Lily. I did only one thing. I kept everything within the law, followed proper procedure, and made sure Lily didn't hear any accusations. Ultimately, the authorities determined that Lily required protection from adult conflicts. Visits would be supervised. Discussions about finances were not to take place in front of her. Lily was protected. When I heard the decision, I sat down for a long time. I didn't feel like I had won. I simply felt a great weight lifted. Because in this struggle, what mattered most wasn't who was right or wrong. It was that a child had not been abandoned in the middle of adult decisions. Things settled more slowly than I had hoped, but also faster than I had once feared. After clear boundaries were established, the atmosphere around Lily gradually changed. She spent most of her time with Daniel. Visits to see me were arranged regularly, unhurried, unstressed. There were no more scrutinizing looks or uncomfortable reminders. Daniel changed more than I expected. He came to pick Lily up on time. He stayed for a few minutes to have tea before leaving. Sometimes he asked me small things, what Lily liked to eat, whether she had been tired lately. Simple questions, but ones that had rarely come up before. I didn't ask Daniel about Melissa. I didn't need the details. I could see that my son was learning to stand firmly in his role as a father, rather than avoiding responsibility as he had before. As for me, I was learning not to interfere too deeply. I didn't offer advice unless I was asked. I didn't bring up the past. I was simply present, at the right moments, and in just the right measure. On afternoons when Lily came over, my small apartment became more lively. She sat drawing at the dining table, colored pencils scattered everywhere. I didn't clean them up right away. I left them there, as if the house itself were learning how to welcome a child. Once Lily pulled me out onto the balcony and pointed down at the sand below. "Grandma, can we go play down there?" We went down to the beach when the sun had softened. Lily took off her shoes and ran barefoot across the sand. She began building a small castle, her entire focus on the task at hand. I sat beside her, picking up seashells to hand to her. "This one is Grandma's," Lily said, placing a shell at one corner of the castle. "And this one is Dad's. This one is mine." She hesitated for a moment, then placed another shell. "This one stays empty. When Mom comes, I'll put it in." I looked at her. My heart softened. No one had taught her that. She understood it naturally, in the way children do. Our family was no longer what it once was, but it was being rearranged in a way that caused less harm. Daniel no longer leaned on me for financial support. He managed on his own. When things were difficult, he didn't turn to me immediately. I thought that was good for both of us. And I no longer felt the need to prove anything. I didn't have to give to stay. I only had to live in my rightful place. Some evenings, after Lily went home, I sat alone on the balcony. The sea was still there. The waves are still steady. I thought about the road behind me, not with regret, but with acceptance. We didn't become a perfect family, but we became a safer one, at least for Lily, and for me, that was enough. One afternoon, as the sun began to sink low, Lily took Daniel's hand and mine and pulled us both toward the beach in front of the building. She built another sandcastle. This one was bigger than before. Lily worked slowly, carefully. She placed each shell, each small piece of driftwood she found along the shore. "This is Grandma's house," she said, pointing to one corner. "This one is Dad's." Then she looked around, thought for a moment, "And this spot is for when Mom is ready." I looked at Daniel. He didn't say anything, just gave a very slight nod. In that moment, I realized that family isn't always about being fully present. Sometimes it's about leaving space, not forcing, not blaming, simply waiting until everyone is calm enough to return. I used to think family was where I had to sacrifice the most, endure the most, stay silent the most. But now I understand something different. A family can only last when there is respect, not respect based on age. However, respect is rooted in the fact that each person is an individual with their own boundaries, emotions, and values. Older adults are not just a source of financial support, not just people who stand behind others, always ready to give without being asked. They also need to be heard. To be respected, to be treated as a real part of the family, not a convenient resource. If I hadn't stopped in time, if I hadn't chosen to respect myself first, everything might have continued as before. I would still be there, giving, waiting, and wondering why I felt increasingly alone within my own family. I didn't defeat anyone. I didn't lose either. I simply chose to step out of a role that was hurting me so that I could return as a mother, a grandmother, and as myself. Daniel grew more mature. Lily had a safe space to grow. And I learned how to slow down, to live fully, and to stop erasing myself just to keep someone close. When night entirely fell, Lily ran up and hugged me from behind. "Today was the happiest day," she said. I smiled. I believed her, because after all the noise, what remained wasn't the house that had been sold, or the money that had been divided. What remained was clarity, boundaries that keep love from turning into harm. If you've listened this far, perhaps you're carrying questions very similar to the ones I once had, about family, about duty, about how to love without losing yourself. Here we listen to stories like these together, gently, slowly, and honestly. If you'd like to continue walking with us, just stay with the channel. Sometimes, a story heard at the right moment is enough to make someone feel less alone. And that, perhaps, is already a perfect beginning.